It had been raining for days, a constant downpour that seemed to seep into every crack of the house. The small, isolated cabin nestled in the woods had been the perfect retreat for Amelia and her fiancé, Sam, to escape the busy city life. But now, as the relentless storm hammered the roof, the cabin felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. The flickering light of the fireplace cast long shadows on the walls, the sound of the crackling fire the only comfort against the howl of the wind outside. Amelia pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes glancing nervously at the rain-soaked window. The relentless tapping of raindrops on the glass echoed in the quiet room, almost as if the storm was trying to reach them. "You okay?" Sam's voice broke through the silence, warm and reassuring. Amelia nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt uneasy. It wasn't the storm, not exactly. It was something else. Something about the rain. The way it seemed to whisper in the night air. "It's just the weather," she said, though the words felt hollow in her throat. Sam didn't seem convinced. He set down his book and walked over to her, sitting down beside her on the couch. He reached for her hand, his touch grounding, though it did little to calm the unease that had settled in her chest. "Maybe we should go check the roof," he suggested, though his tone carried more curiosity than concern. "Make sure it's not leaking." Amelia frowned. "It's fine. We don't need to go out there in this weather." But Sam's eyes seemed drawn to something beyond the cabin, something hidden in the thick, impenetrable darkness. He stood up. "I'll be quick." She watched him grab his jacket and head for the door. The howling wind outside grew louder, almost like it was calling to him. Something didn't feel right about it. She tried to shake the feeling but couldn't quite let it go. As Sam stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him, leaving Amelia alone in the dim glow of the fire. She stared at the door, waiting for him to return. The storm outside had intensified, the wind now rattling the windows, the rain slashing against the cabin like sharp needles. The shadows around her seemed to grow longer, stretching into unnatural shapes. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest as she sat there, frozen in place, listening. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed from the window, louder now, and yet it wasn't the rain anymore. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, her body stiffening in fear. The tapping was too precise, too deliberate. And then, the whispering. "Amelia." The voice was faint, barely audible over the storm, but it was there. It called her name in a low, breathy hiss, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. Her body tensed, her heart raced. She stood up quickly and moved to the door, throwing it open just as the wind howled through the crack, pushing her back. "Sam?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no response. She stepped outside, the heavy rain instantly soaking through her clothes. The forest around her seemed alive, the trees groaning and creaking in the wind. Her eyes scanned the darkness, but she saw nothing. Tap, tap, tap. It was closer now, the sound of fingers against glass, but there was no window in front of her. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere behind her. Amelia spun around, her eyes widening as she caught sight of a figure standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the thick trees. It was Sam, or at least, it looked like him. His form was hunched, his back to her as if he were staring into the forest, unmoving. "Sam," she called again, her voice weak with fear. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly turned its head toward her, and she gasped. The face that stared back at her was not Sam's. It was twisted, pale, and gaunt. The eyes wide with a haunting emptiness that seemed to see straight through her. The mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, lips pulled too tightly, exposing yellow teeth. It wasn't human. Amelia screamed, stumbling backward, the rain pouring down around her. But before she could move, the thing stepped forward, its fingers extended toward her. Tap, tap, tap. The rain poured heavily, a constant oppressive rhythm that drummed on the roof of the old farmhouse. Ava sat by the window, watching the storm rage outside, her eyes fixated on the darkness beyond the glass. The wind howled, sending the branches of the nearby trees twisting and creaking in unnatural ways. The house groaned under the pressure of the storm, as if it were alive, struggling to hold itself together. It had been a few months since Eva and her husband, David, had moved to this rural farmhouse. They had hoped for a quiet life away from the noise and bustle of the city, but ever since they arrived, something had felt off about the place. The town was small, isolated, and the locals barely spoke to them, as though they were hiding something. It was as if the house itself had a history that no one wanted to talk about. Eva glanced over at David, who was sitting in the armchair near the fireplace, reading a book. He seemed completely unfazed by the storm, his focus entirely on the pages in front of him. Eva envied his calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the storm, it was something deeper. "David," she said softly, her voice tinged with unease. "Do you ever hear things in the night?" David looked up from his book, his expression one of mild curiosity. "What do you mean?" Ava hesitated, unsure of how to explain it. "Like whispers or strange noises coming from the walls." David set the book down, sensing her discomfort. "No, I haven't heard anything. Are you sure you're not just imagining it? You've been stressed lately with all the unpacking and everything." Ava bit her lip. She hadn't imagined it. It was real. Late at night, when the house was still and the wind howled outside, she would hear it. The faintest sound of voices, almost like murmurs, coming from somewhere deep inside the walls. Sometimes it sounded like crying. Other times it was as if someone was calling her name. "I'm not imagining it," she insisted, her voice growing stronger. "There's something here, David. Something wrong with this house." David looked at her for a moment, his expression softening. "Maybe we should have the place checked out. Have someone come in and see if there's something with the plumbing or the insulation causing the noises." Ava nodded, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just the pipes or the walls. Something far worse was lurking in the shadows. That night, the storm raged on, and the air in the house grew thick with tension. Eva couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made her heart race. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange noises and the feeling of being watched. She had the overwhelming sense that she was not alone. Suddenly she heard it. Whisper. A low, guttural voice, so faint that she almost dismissed it as part of her imagination. But it wasn't. It came again, louder this time, as if calling to her from the walls. "Eva." Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. She glanced over at David, who was still fast asleep beside her. He hadn't heard it. But Eva knew what she had heard. Someone, or something, was trying to reach her. The voice came again, louder, more urgent. "Ava, come." Without thinking, she threw the covers off and got out of bed. She had to know where the voice was coming from. She crept through the dark hallway, the only light coming from the flickering lightning outside. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but all she could hear was the voice, faint but growing clearer. "Ava, come to me." She followed the sound, moving deeper into the house. The air felt colder here, the walls colder than they should have been. She reached the basement door, and the voice seemed to come from below. A chill ran down her spine. She knew she shouldn't go down there. But the voice, so soft and pleading, called to her, and she couldn't resist. Slowly, she opened the door, the creak of the hinges echoing in the silence. The basement was dark, a void of nothingness, save for the faintest glimmer of light coming from a small, cracked window near the ceiling. The floorboards creaked under her feet as she descended, her heart hammering in her chest. "Ava, come closer." The voice was louder now, almost like it was right behind her, but there was no one there. The cold, damp air clung to her skin as she stepped further into the basement. She could see a faint shape in the corner, a dark figure standing motionless in the shadows. "Who's there?" Eva called out, her voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, its face obscured by the darkness, but she could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. Then, in an instant, the figure moved, stepping toward her with an unnatural speed. Eva stumbled back, her heart racing, but her feet wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, her body gripped by an unseen force. The figure came closer, and as it emerged from the shadows, Eva saw its face pale, gaunt, and twisted in a grotesque expression. Its eyes were black as night, devoid of any emotion or humanity. The lips parted into a chilling grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. "Welcome home, Eva," the figure whispered, its voice rasping like the wind through dead leaves. Eva's blood ran cold. She turned to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the house seemed to close in around her. The walls pulsed with a dark energy, the whispers growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. "Eva!" The voice was no longer faint. It was everywhere, surrounding her, suffocating her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm outside stopped. The house fell silent, the darkness thick and suffocating. Eva woke in her bed, drenched in sweat, her heart still racing. The storm had passed and the house was still, but the echo of the voice, the face, haunted her every waking moment. She never spoke of what happened in the basement. No one believed her anyway. But every night, as the wind howled outside and the rain beat against the windows, she could still hear the whispers. "Eva, come to me." It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A weekend retreat in a remote cottage nestled in the woods, far away from the stresses of the city. Emma and her friends, Sarah and Jake, had rented Briarwood Cottage from a local owner who had assured them that it was the perfect spot for some quiet relaxation. The cottage was charming at first glance, quaint, old-fashioned, and surrounded by towering trees that provided a canopy against the drizzle. The sound of rain tapping on the roof added to the tranquil atmosphere, but Emma couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, as though the house had been holding its breath for decades. The owner had warned them about the isolation, mentioning that the cottage had been vacant for a long time before he decided to rent it out. He had casually mentioned that it was perfectly safe, but failed to elaborate on why it had been empty for so long. It was late in the afternoon when they arrived, and by nightfall, the storm outside had turned into a full-blown downpour. The wind howled as the rain lashed against the windows, and the trees outside swayed violently. The atmosphere felt unnervingly thick, as if the world outside the cottage had vanished, leaving them in an isolated bubble of darkness. Emma, who had always been sensitive to her surroundings, felt it first. It was a strange feeling, like someone was watching her, a presence that lingered in the corners of the room. At first she thought it was just her imagination. After all, the weather was dismal, and the cottage had that eerie, old house feel to it. But as the night wore on, she became increasingly aware of the strange sounds echoing through the house. The first noise was subtle, a creaking floorboard, then another. Emma dismissed it as the old house settling, but as the night deepened, the creaks became more deliberate, almost rhythmic, like footsteps. It was as if someone was walking around the house, when no one was supposed to be there. She mentioned it to Sarah, who laughed it off. "It's just the storm," Sarah said, pulling a blanket over her legs. "The house is old. It's probably just the wind." But then they heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Help me!" Emma's blood ran cold. The voice was low, distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the storm or the wind. It was coming from inside the house. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah and Jake exchanged nervous glances. "It's probably just the house settling," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. But even he seemed unnerved now. The three of them stayed in the living room for a while, trying to shake the feeling of unease that hung in the air. They played cards, tried to make jokes, but the house seemed to press in on them with an unnatural weight. The sound of rain pounding against the windows was the only thing that masked the soft whispers, which seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Eventually, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She excused herself to go upstairs to the guest room. She needed to sleep and try to get rid of the creeping feeling of dread. But as she passed the hallway that led to the staircase, she stopped dead in her tracks. At the top of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light, was a shadow. It was a figure tall, dark, and standing perfectly still. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting for her. "Sarah? Jake?" Emma called, her voice trembling. But no one answered. The figure remained motionless, and the longer Emma stared, the more her vision began to blur. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy, like they were glued to the floor. A cold, icy chill swept through her body as the figure began to slowly move toward her. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like something that wasn't quite human. The whisper came again. This time it was louder, clearer. "Help me, help me!" Emma's heart raced. She turned and bolted up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she reached the guest room. She slammed the door shut behind her and leaned against it, trying to steady her breathing. The storm outside had intensified, but it was the sound of footsteps that terrified her the most. They were coming closer, soft, measured steps on the old wooden floor. They stopped just outside the door. There was a long silence, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, a single hollow knock on the door. "Emma!" The voice came again, soft and pleading, now unmistakably coming from the other side of the door. "Help me." Emma couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She knew that voice. It was the same one that had whispered earlier, but now it was so close, so real. With trembling hands, Emma reached for her phone and dialed Sarah's number. It rang and rang, but no answer. She tried Jake's number next, but the same thing happened. The only sound in the room was the relentless tapping of the rain against the window, and the soft, hollow footsteps moving away from the door. In a panic, Emma opened the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, the shadows stretching and twisting in the dim light. She stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers had stopped, but the air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. "Sarah! Jake!" Emma called again, her voice shaking. She hurried down the stairs and found the living room empty. The fire had died out in the hearth, casting the room into darkness. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the wall, a dark stain, as though something had been smeared across the wallpaper. It wasn't a stain at all. It was writing. "Help me," it said, the words slowly bleeding into the walls, as though they were being carved there by an invisible hand. Emma's heart stopped. She turned, but there was no one there. Just the eerie silence of the house, broken only by the soft, whispering voices that seemed to surround her. She didn't know how long she stood there, paralyzed with fear. Then, in a flash, the front door slammed open, and the storm poured in. The last thing Emma remembered before she blacked out was the figure standing in the doorway, its face pale and twisted, its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, and the whisper, soft and insistent, echoing in her ears. "Help me!"